Hello and welcome to the FatBoss guide to Zul in Uldir. So this 2-phase encounter is actually quite short, averaging around 5 minutes for a kill. You'll mainly be focusing on ad control during phase 1, before having to burn the boss down as soon as possible during phase 2. So without further ado, let's kick straight into it. Now Zul himself doesn't need to be actively tanked during phase 1, and as a result he can't actually be positioned easily. Instead he will just be spam casting Shadow Barrage onto random players, dealing a bit of damage and applying a dot. More impactfully, he will be applying Dark Revelation debuffs to 2 players on a timer. This is only put on 1 player on normal. This 10-second debuff explodes upon expiration, dealing a huge burst of damage to the entire group that does drop off with distance. The 2 players should move to opposite edges of the room before they expire, whilst the raid huddles around the middle of the room with the boss and his ads. The healers need to make sure that everyone is healthy before this damage comes in, as it can very easily finish people off. When the debuffs expire, some minion of Zul ads will spawn nearby. These ads fixate people and will fear anyone they come into contact with. The ads can be killed off via damage, but more notably, you can just purge them. Assign some purges to each debuff to remove the ads before they have a chance to cause a problem, with Master Spells and Arcane Torrents being the strongest. Now on Heroic, Zul will occasionally spawn a Pool of Darkness, which pulses out damage onto the entire raid if it isn't soaked. Have a single range player stand within the pool just to prevent this damage, but just make sure to keep that player topped up as they will be taking quite a lot of ticking damage themselves. So that's all that Zul does himself. Let's look at his more dangerous ads. He will be spawning these ads throughout phase 1 with his Call of Blood cast. DPS should focus these ads over the boss at all times, however they should generally be grouped up underneath the boss just to allow DPS to cleave damage onto Zul, only moving ads away from him when mechanics dictate. Now there are 3 different types of ads in this fight. You've got Crushers, Blood Hexers and Krogs. Crushers have a frontal swipe that needs to be faced away from the raid. They also have an energy bar which, when filled, causes the Crusher to cast Thrumming Pulse, which buffs all ads and Zul within 30 yards with a 50% damage increase for 40 seconds. If you have good enough damage you can actually kill the Crusher before he gets to cast this, but if you do know it's going to go through, make sure the tank drags the Crusher over 30 yards away from the rest of the pack before the cast, and then after the cast has gone off you can just bring him back for cleave damage. Tanks, these Crushers spawn at the very edge of the encounter space, just make sure you pick them up quickly. Moving on to the Blood Hexers, they just spam cast Bloodshot, dealing damage to the player with the lowest health in the raid. Just make sure you interrupt this as much as possible. When the Blood Hexer gets full energy, it will spawn an animated Ica ad, which will move towards Zul. When it reaches him, it will heal Zul for the health the ad has remaining. Tanks should move the Blood Hexer 10 to 15 yards away from Zul if this is due to be cast, just to prevent the ad from immediately hitting the boss. DPS should nuke this Ica down as soon as possible whilst using crowd control to keep it at bay, most notably stuns, knockbacks and grips. 2 Hexers will spawn in when Zul casts Call of Blood, each of them in different corners of the encounter space. On Heroic, the Blood Hexers have an aura which causes them to heal all nearby enemies, including Zul, for 10% max HP every 2 seconds. This aura is only ever activated when 2 or more Blood Hexers are within 20 yards of each other. This forces the raid to keep the 2 Hexers apart at all times. We recommend that you hard CC one Hexer whilst you kill the other. Once it has died, quickly drag in and kill the CC'd Hexer before a new set spawns in. The third type of ad, the Krogs, have a passive that heals them for 200% of the damage they deal. However, this isn't a big issue as these Krogs don't really do a lot of damage. However, the Krogs do need to be killed before they reach 100% energy, otherwise they will kill themselves, exploding and applying a really nasty dot to the entire raid. That being said, you do have a fair amount of time to defeat these doggies before this happens, but it is still important that DPS focus them over damaging the boss. And once again, that goes for the rest of the ads as well. Focus the Blood Hexers, then the Crushers, then the doggies, then the boss. Now as you can notice, this entirety of phase 1 is very much to do with where ads are spawning in just so you can deal with them as soon as possible. We highly recommend that you mark every single edge and corner of the encounter space with a raid marker just to make communication amongst your guild that much easier.
Now when you get Zul to 40% health, phase 2 will begin. Ideally you'll want to do this transition with no ads up or at least very few of them. As he transitions, he will knock back every single player in the raid, so it is important that you're not stood too close to the edge, otherwise you will be knocked off. At the same time, he will apply dots to the entire raid. The amount of stacks that this dot has is completely based on how long it took you to do phase 1. The longer you took, the more stacks you gain. Now from this point onwards, Zul will no longer spawn any ads, he won't apply Dark Revelation to anyone, or spam cast his Shadow Barrage, and instead will melee hit, so he does need to be tanked, but he will continue to cast his Pool of Darkness, and this is actually the first point on normal mode where you'll actually see it. Now, whilst tanking Zul, it's very important that you face him away from the rest of the raid, because he'll cast Rupturing Blood, which is a frontal cleave which applies a debuff. This debuff deals incredibly high ticking damage, and when it does eventually expire on you, it will leave a large patch of goo on the ground. Tanks will want to swap around 4 stacks of this ability, and before it does expire on you, you need to make sure that you're far away from the rest of the raid to place the pool out of harm's way. After the first pool is spawned, the tanks can just keep going back to the middle of that pool every single time to go drop off their debuff, just to save room for the rest of the raid. Now, positioning is key in this phase because of the Death Wish ability. 2 players will be debuffed with this and will run towards the closest edge of the encounter space and then jump off. When they jump off, or when the ability is dispelled, they would trigger a Dark Revelation explosion, although it deals reduced damage in this phase. Now, as the debuff forces players to run towards the nearest edge, the raid needs to position so the edge closest to them doesn't lead them through Zul and his cleave, or through a patch of goo. The boss should be positioned slightly off-center, whilst the rest of the raid stacks directly behind him. This way, anyone who gets the debuff will run away from Zul, meaning they won't get cleaved, and also away from the puddles, as the tanks have put them in a good place. As soon as players are close to the edge, they should be dispelled, and then the purgers in your raid should go and remove the minion of Zul adds before they reach the raid. But that's all it is to this phase. It's definitely the hardest part of the encounter. The sheer amount of incoming damage is just a little bit crazy. People are just going to be dropping all over the place. We really recommend just saving all healing cooldowns for this last point of the fight. Ideally also saving DPS cooldowns if you can, and just lust to nuke the living shit out of the boss, hopefully killing him before he kills you.
Now, if you want any clear reminders and more information for this encounter with sweet raid positioning maps, spell tooltips, and up-to-date strategies and more, then go check out our guide over on Wowhead. A link for that can be found in the description below. Thanks to our sponsor Discord on this guide series. They've recently greatly improved their in-game overlay. As well as displaying people in your voice channel, you can now see text chats, meaning that you no longer need to tab out to keep in touch with your friends or your guild, or for what we find most useful, keeping track of the news through the Wowhead news bot, as well as individual boss tips that can be found over on our Discord. Enabling the overlay is super simple. Just go into user settings and make sure the overlay is enabled for the game you're playing, click on the overlay setting, enable it, set a keybind, and you're done. Coming soon to the overlay is the ability to pin text channels, so you can keep part of any Discord channel whilst you play. Also, a big thank you to our supporters over on Patreon. Your continued support really does mean a lot, so thank you so much. And lastly, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for watching.